5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Welcome to the already not yet.
Thy greatest adversary. One must understand that our adversaries do not play by laws and rules. Especially our laws and rules. However, they are determined to use our rules and laws against us even as they seek to replace and impose their own versions and interpretations of them. Our adversaries seek to use us against us and others against us while creating conditions in us that mitigate our ability to push back punitively against them. Hostile goals and objectives. 1. To foster conditions to erode all areas of society from within, seeding it with the seeds of deception and destruction. 2. To cause death by 1,000 cuts. 3. To create conditions to keep us locked into our own rules and predictability while degrading us across all 7 spheres of societal influence. 4. Using the adversary's strengths against them while creating more vulnerabilities, while hitting the weaknesses and newly created ones. Unrestricted warfare, chaos warfare and corporatocratic durable disorder. 5. To wear down and wear out, breaking the will to fight against their designs. 6. Mythos projected, to create the global appearance of America and our allies being the irrational aggressor while painting themselves in false light as being the rational actor to deceive people, tribes, interests and nations. 7. Whitewash, create the appearances that they are strong and, painted black, we are weak and corrupted alongside our ideals, systems of economics and governance. They wish to convince both their citizens and ours of this. This is reality inversion, projection and perception shaping. The triggered state response modality. 1. Distort. 2. Deceive. 3. Distrust. 4. Divert. 5. Divide. 6. Degrade. 7. Dependence. 8. Devour. 9. Destroy. This is how they do it. 1. Identify strengths and use them against them by targeting them with means and methods to weaken them covertly by redirecting their strengths into traps which create and/or expose their weak points. 2. Foster greed and pride and then use it against them, having lured them into a trap that makes them and their wealth, reputations and influence dependent upon you. 3. Lure into foreign traps while exposing their domestic vulnerabilities to exploitation. 4. Sow confusion in the leadership and citizenry of your targeted nation. Then create an environment conducive for political correctness. 5. Find useful idiots to use as agitators to create an environment of fear, suspicion and chaos. They will be indoctrinated with lies and mixtures of facts and fictions to whip up hatred against their unsuspecting fellow citizens. 6. Gain influence and control of thought leaders and influencers across many key organizations and in important critical educational institutions. 7. Implement a pharmaco strategy to poison citizenry with drugs to create social and health crisis using corporate interests and illicit criminal channels. The resulting cascading effects will allow you to make money on the destruction of your foes while costing them increasing amounts of money in attempting to mitigate the cascading ripple effects. 8. Poison the information and co-opt the 7 spheres of influence while gradually taking over industries and organizations with which one can solidify influence operations. Undermining the cohesion of each of the 7 spheres allows for a steady corrupting of the society at every level over time, allowing you to gain power, wealth and control over increasingly larger swaths of the private and public sector. 9. Work through proxies to fuel the fires between the divergent groups in that country with truth mixed with fiction to bring it to a boil. Spark social unrest so as to trigger blowback from the other side or sides. The more oppositional sides the better, because it is easier to use them all against one another by simple social engineering and disinformation tactics. 10. Play the wise sage or good potential ally, to gain influence over the group or groups with which you think you can manipulate the entire nation state with and can gain the most political capital from. 11. Set them up to appear complicit with unethical, illegal or plant actual compromising evidence so they cannot get out of your trap. Offer to keep it secret if they meet some predetermined set of requirements which you can use against them directly as well as their opposition could use against them. If they decide to turn against you. Or 12. Do the same with their opposition so you can play the two or more off of one another. by taking a multi-target approach where you feed all oppositional sides real and manufactured secret information on their perceived enemies, which fosters that believe your lie and make them easier to manipulate. 13. Covertly foster extremism in all the opposing groups who you then manipulate into becoming an ideological and, if need be, a militarized ones. 14. Fuel each opposing group with disinformation and false evidence which feeds their confirmation bias, reinforcing their fear and hatred of the others. 15. Manufacture events which will bring the two or more oppositional groups into a conflict zone. An example would be a protest. Embed agitators in both sides to trigger violence. 16. Use the manufactured event to create more propaganda to feed to all oppositional groups. 17. Play the false peacemaker while you extract as much information and political and economic capital as you can, using their binary opposition to one another as a cover and blame-shifting mechanism. 18. Isolate the nation from their allies and their leaders from influences which are not in line with your goals. 19. Repeat the above with increasing intensity within targets and expand to neighboring countries, using the same strategy and tactics to play them all off one another while you gain more power over all of them yet appear to be the rational peacemaker. 20. Break their next level alliances through machinations and obscuration. 21. Create a perceived threat or a final trust-breaking series of public events between those nations who were once allied with them to sow deeper divisions. 22. Feed all of them real and false information on one another until they don't know how to trust one another. 23. All the while continuing to feed each of those nation-states disinformation which exponentially increases the confusion, divisions and chaos among their people against their leaders and their leaders against their people, and divide them into every possible way against one another. 24. Bring it all to the cusp of total collapse and then step in as a benevolent helping hand to heal the wounds you created to gain the trust of them all. 25. Then make them all a proxy alliance against those who refuse to join the false construct and false peace to be used as a power block economically, politically and militarily to regain full superpower status. 26. Promote a multipolar power world to address the manufactured appearances created by the weaponized narrative which have slandered, accused and corrupted the manufactured threat. 27. Then attempt to play those other power blocks against one another, having laid the groundwork via systematic infiltration, propaganda and shows to render oppositional nations ineffective at the least to stand against the global takeover goals, and at the worst bring them to their destruction by first rotting their culture from within, weakening every structure of power in those nations, them triggering social unrest, economic instability, distrust in their government and leaders, them triggered civil wars. 28. Seed all targeted nations with ideological proxies who can act as mouthpieces the escalation of the propaganda war. Gain influence in all 7 spheres of influence and establish weaponizable social engineering mechanisms up within networks. 29. Then lure those nations into protracted conflicts with nations you have covertly supplied weapons, technology and expertise to, which bog them down in within their own region or in multiple wars around the world, spreading out their armed forces to the point of vulnerability. 30. Then play cat and mouse military games to put more pressures on those openly and covertly targeted nations. This can provide a means of studying deployment patterns, force costly deployments, draining financial means over time, degrading and wearing down personnel and equipment. It also can provide a diversion, focusing attention away from one's domestic operations onto foreign adventures while allowing hostile forces to operate more easily in their adversaries' homelands. See the 7 spheres of influence operations. See how magicians divert the attention of an audience. 31. Covertly arm and support proxies embedded within their homeland, or in nearby nations from which they can cross the borders and infiltrate the targeted nations. 32. Degrade and destroy the will to fight within nations by use of weaponized pharmaco and a flood of disinformation and weaponized narrative strategies to poison, wear down, break physically and mentally by applying increasing societal stresses impacting health and well-being of public. These types of operations cause confusion, division and conflict within the populations of the nations, amplifying stresses and increasing tensions between various demographics, starting and fueling escalating cyclical conflict feedback loops between those various demographics. 33. then hit them with asymmetrical cyber and terrorist-like attacks, putting both the government and the population into utter chaos, while you use more proxies like Iran and North Korea to provoke military conflict on an already stretched-out military so they are tied down, then hit the homeland with a WMD like an EMP blast or a couple of nukes using proxies. Or threaten it and capture the entire power grid and financial systems via cyber war tactics. Then you deliver your terms for that nation's surrender or total destruction. Sound familiar? It should. You are living in the middle of it. These are just the base levels of meta warfare. As it is for people, so too it is for the nation. Max DAVES.
There's a lot of people concerned about the wars and rumors of wars that are going on right now. There's a lot to be concerned about, but you cannot let your concerns overarch your ability to reason through and think through what is occurring. Now that's very, very important. Yes, there are all kinds of things occurring dealing with China and Taiwan, the South China Sea, the Philippines, and in the Middle East with Iran and Israel and Syria and Turkey, and in the Ukraine with the Russians and NATO. And while you're focused on that, you also need to understand that you need to think through the areas that no one else is looking at. Remember, you need to learn to zig when everybody else is zagging. That doesn't mean you don't keep an eye on those things, but you don't get wrapped up and completely controlled and obsessed with tracking all those things while you miss other areas, including here in the homeland and in this hemisphere. You need to be able to do both and not get myopic on any of them. That's macro level situational awareness and strategic awareness. And the reason why I tell you that is that there's a lot of fear, a lot of concern, and I understand that. But you also have to understand that you cannot let your fear, your concern, rule you, or it will infect your thinking and cause you to make poor decisions. You cannot allow yourself to get into a place of reactionary decision making. Reactionary decision making alone will create all kinds of problems for you, vulnerabilities for you, and strategic and tactical traps for you. So you need to learn to be disciplined and patient when observing these things and analyzing all of these situations ongoing. You also need to be realistic. You need to understand what your capabilities are in a humble way and what your weaknesses are in a brutally honest way. Now, I'm not telling you this because I think a conflict is imminent or not. I'm telling you this because this is good operational, right? Operational awareness and operational process and protocol. It's smart, regardless of what happens. You cannot control all things all the time. You cannot know all things all the time. So you have to learn to decrease the noise to signal problem. You need more clear signal and less noise. And that means you're going to have to practice some discipline in how you take in information and pull back. You got to learn to zig, and you've got to learn to zag. Now, what I'm telling you to do doesn't mean you don't prepare for possibilities. Should always be prepared. But you also have to understand that there's preparation will only get you so far in an uncertain environment. And because you can't know all things and you can't base all things upon how things merely appear, you have to be able to adapt quickly and exercise discernment. And you also have to learn to listen to your gut. You have to learn to test things. So, when you look at the geopolitical, geostrategic realities going on, there's a lot of stuff that can lure you into a myopathy where you only are looking at certain things and ignoring the others, which can create a big trap for you. So you need to be more polymathic in your views. You need to look at these things and how they all interact together. Not just at a theater level or sub-theater level. You need to look at things from a point of view of how all of these things play out together and put the potential options of what's occurring on the board. And don't be rash and jump too quickly to conclusions of what you think is happening without proper vetting of your analysis. Now, I'm not telling you anything you don't already know, or you should know. What I'm telling you, and why I'm telling you, at the time I'm telling you, is because it's very easy to lose sight of those things when there's a lot of stuff going on. But you need to look at all the stuff going on individually and collectively as a whole. And that will help you get a better picture potentially of what may be occurring and if there's any correlation between possible events occurring and possibilities for things that could occur. There's a reason why I'm always talking about the 7 spheres of influence and how things work, right? Here at home and away in other places. And our tendency has been to ignore certain things while we hyper-focus on other things, leaving the back door open. And we can't do that this time. We're going to have to look at things collectively together. So when you're looking at what's happening in any of the regions that I talked about, you need to look at the regions that I haven't talked about and the regions where you may have not even considered being a part of your calculations and your analysis. Again, even in those areas, across all of those regions and all those situations, you need to look at the strategic implications individually and collectively, and you need to look at the tactical realities and the strategic realities and how they work together. That'll give you a clearer picture. Likewise, you need to be aware and humble enough to realize that there are simply things that you don't know and you're not going to know. And you're going to have to be okay with that. You can't allow that to fuel fear, which fuels even more poor decision making. Now, even though you've got a chaotic environment, it's not as chaotic as it could be. So you need to learn to operate in the level that it's chaotic now and prepare yourself for even more chaotic times so that you have skills, right, to handle it, means to handle it. And you have to realize that you cannot control chaos. You can mitigate some aspects of it, but the moment that you try to control all the chaos is the moment that you get lured into a trap, and the chaos then becomes even greater, and it further degrades and impedes your ability to make proper decisions and act on those decisions properly. So consider what I'm telling you on this. These concepts are not just applicable to national security and defense, but they're also applicable to anything that involves organization and decision making, including your own individual lives. You must learn to test your signals and your signals intelligence. And I mean that as much in terms of a metaphor and figuratively as I do in real time, real space, and real signals intelligence. Including how you operate and communicate, and what you operate and communicate in and with now, and what you'll have to be able to do later in various scenarios and possibilities that could arise. You cannot always operate, and you can't be prepared if you're not prepared to operate without the technology that you have and without some of the capabilities you may be over-reliant on. So you need to be cognizant of what those are, and you need to correct that now. And that includes from the top down and the bottom up. That means you got to do some problem solving, and you got to game things out. And you got to make sure that the people that are in decision making in those levels within that, right, the command and control decision making process, and those that have to carry it out, are prepared along with you to be able to do what they need to do and adapt to changing conditions, whatever they may be them man-made or natural. Because you're going to be operating, having to deal with both, regardless of what happens in any of the potential conflict zones that we're talking about. And when I say conflict zones or potential theater of operations, I'm also talking about here in the Western Hemisphere and in our own country. You have to consider what that looks like, and you have to be prepared in a way where you can adapt to all of those things as much as you can. Because if you can't adapt now, you sure as hell won't be able to adapt in greater chaos and confusion. And you won't be creative in it. And you've got to exercise some creative thinking and some adaptive thinking, some adaptive problem solving. And you've got to also, it's got to be second nature, along with critical thinking skills. You've got to be able to detach from your own presuppositions and assumptions and confirmation biases when you're making decisions as best that you are able And you've got to be able to look at things as they are, not as you would like them to be, or make them worse than they are, because you are projecting onto what you're seeing your own insufficiencies. That includes policy, right? Both at home and away. Those are things that you have to consider now. And do more than consider, you have to prepare now, and they have to become ingrained into you and how you do things. You cannot assume that what has worked before will work again. It would be better for you to assume that all the things that you have done before will not work. Because at least then you can prepare for what won't work in the event that something doesn't work. And that will also give you more adaptability and flexibility and complex environments in which you will have to operate. So that said, the situation that we're dealing with across the board appears to be a lot of different things. But just because it appears to be a lot of different things doesn't necessarily mean it is any of those things. Appearances can be deceiving, and the nature of war is all war is deception to one degree or another. So you're going to have to burn through the fog that tries to impede your thinking, even now, and get used to doing that. That's why I say to you that you cannot allow the noise floor to overtake your signals, both the ones in your own head, in your own thinking, and those beyond you, in technological means and otherwise. So dealing with the situation in the Ukraine, well, there's a lot of complexity. As there is everywhere. And it's easy to assume that you have a clearer view on what's occurring than you might actually have, which is why you have to be humble. You have to be rational and cogent in your assessments. You also have to understand that there is the potential that you may be in a situation where some you may consider allies or friends or friendly in a situation. They may not be so in the time of a conflict for a myriad of reasons. So you have to plan for that, even though it's difficult to think in those terms sometimes. Right? So, again, that just gives you a palette of probabilities and possibilities and things that you've gamed out so that you can adapt more quickly in case you encounter any of those possibilities. I'm not asking you to weigh them. I'm asking you to prepare for them. And the same means and methods at which you prepare for those are the same means and methods that are going to be helpful to you in applying it to other things. Okay? It's an integrated framework of thinking and doing. So, what has been occurring is you've been in a situation where your near peer competitors and enemies are playing clickbait warfare on you. Death by 1,000 cuts by another name. meant to wear down, wear out, and get an idea for how you're going to operate in various scenarios so they can prepare for them. It's a way of probing, gaining vital intelligence before anything might go above the threshold into actual kinetic war or conflict. But most of what is occurring is a testing, right? So here we are, we have a new administration. There are some who perceive it as being highly weak. They perceive the country as being highly divided, right? And so that creates a set of vulnerabilities and possibilities in their eyes, which may be exploitable. Now, you all know that. But you need to game out both sides of that equation as far as you can so that you can put yourself in the shoes of those who are your adversaries, or might be your adversaries, and see it from their point of view. There are a lot of things that look divergent that are not divergent. There are a lot of things that are occurring, and it doesn't mean that it's all some secret cabal behind the scenes. Part of being in leadership, particularly in national security, is understanding, right, the complexities as best as you are able, right? And not jumping to conclusions too quickly, but not being paralyzed in your decision makings when you need to take action. But also not being lured into taking action that you don't need to take. Again, it takes discipline. Right? So when you look at how Russia's moved troops en masse on the borders of Ukraine, there are a lot of things you can glean from that. But you need to game it out from their scenario. What would they have to gain immediately by taking that risk and sparking a regional conflict? What is it? What are the implications of that in the other regions and other potential theaters of battle that you may be faced with? And how does it affect them in other regions and other areas? Does it create vulnerabilities? Does it create possible cascade effect chains that might be triggered, right, by an action, a larger action being taken in the Ukraine by the Russians or by you? Who does it benefit? Including those that seemingly are staying out of it and apparently, look as if they have nothing to gain from it because they're just standing back. But you need to look at what they would gain from it by standing back and allowing everybody else to fight. So you need to think about that. You need to think about the possibility that a third party, right, that is not a nation-state actor per se, could create the conditions to create more conflict between nation states and trigger a broader conflict. They may be useful proxies, or there may be a deeper, more insidious reason why they're doing what they're doing, and it may be hidden in layers. And there may or may not be nation states backing that. So you need to think through those things. What does that look like? What are the earmarks of that? Because if that were to happen, one of the things that's going to be very difficult is attribution. And, if something were to occur, you could be easily lured into a conflict with another nation state, when and both of you having been conned and deceived into fighting a fight that neither one of you should be in because you were both deceived. So you need to think about those things. You know, what's your process? What's your protocol? How do you analyze that? You know, how do you weigh the data in a rational and cogent way without dumping your own confirmation biases and projections into it? And you need to think about what actors on the board would benefit by doing something like that. Who would even have the capabilities of doing that, much less any intent to pull off something like that to pull others in. Right? And is there a history of them having done any of these things? I mean, there's a lot of stuff that happens in the clandestine world. Right? And you've got a very complex set of potential actors across the board. Right? So, you got a lot of people with a lot of intent. But you also have a lot of near-peer competitors and, you know, enemies, if you want to put it bluntly, that are together a house of thieves, and none of them trust one another either. So you need to think through how you can leverage that against them. Right? So, what is the long-term goal if you were to get into a conflict with Russia in the Ukraine? What do you stand to gain, both away and at home, in doing such a thing? Weigh it out. You've got unique complexities in each one of these regions, in each one of these potential theaters. You know, the last thing that you want is a bunch of naval ships stuck in brown water or green water and not able to operate free and clear easily, or be stuck there because access points in and out are compromised, either through quote-unquote accidents that mysteriously happen in a timely way to create a greater problem, or intentional, obvious acts of active denial of usage of those passages, like the Bosphorus, for example, the Suez Canal. List goes on, right? What are your contingencies? Because you don't want to get bottled up. And you can't bet the house on that your technology and your superior firepower will be able to outlast that if you're stuck. So what are you going to do? Okay? How are you going to support that from a standoff position if that were to occur? You know, what assets do you need that you can bring to bear and need to be near the theater of operations where they would have to provide cover in any of those contingencies? What do you have in place? What could you utilize? And what do you need to get there? And then you have to game out how are you going to get it there, and potential in a way that could slide it under the deck, right? And not be so obvious about it, because you're probably going to be contested in a lot more places than you expect. You need to plan for that. You need to think about that. And you need to take it seriously. That's why you need to think more like how your near-peer competitors and enemies will think. So red teaming that out and being hard. Don't be easy on yourself. Be brutally honest. And play that out. Don't just expect, algorithms to do it for you. You're going to have to expect the unexpected, which means you're going to have to think in terms of what, could be, regardless of how unlikely it may or may seem to you. I've done that. Many others have too. But when I tell you that, I want you to think about the possibility of, and this is why I said earlier, right? You need to look at all of the pieces, not just myopically in one area. You need to look at all of it, right? Because conflicts could occur, could very easily not just be regional, but be global. And when that happens, as you know, throughout history, there's all kinds of changes in alliances and friends and foes. So you need to look at that. You need to game it out. If you were our adversaries, what would you do? Would you continue with the death by 1,000 cuts, right? Until you think that we are weakened enough that you could make a move and go in for the kill, and then strike all at once, many places all at once, in a variety of ways and means and methods. And if so, how would you do it? You need to have that as second nature. You need to know now. Because when you get into a situation, and let's say that the ultimate chaos starts, let's say that you have what happened, that your enemies have gamed out. Remember the Tet Offensive? Imagine that on a global scale. What would that look like? Don't just look at your successes throughout history. Spend more time on your defeats and how you got defeated in battles. And then study your enemy and near-peer competitors and potential frenemies, successes and failures. You're going to have to be able to adapt. So, if you are going to try to remove the American footprint from around the world, and you were going to pull off a Tet offensive of a sort at a global scale, how would you do it? What would you do? I know how I would do it. But it's not about me. I want you to think through it. I want you to think through what it would look like. Down to the gnat's ass. Strategically and tactically. How would you do it? What would you use? How would you manage all the various components that it would take to pull off an operation like that? And how could you pull it off or prepare for it without anybody knowing? How would you do that? That's what I mean, that you cannot count on your traditional playbook as you've always done it. Your traditional playbook is going to have to be the diversion. You're going to have to think differently. Much more asymmetrically. And you're going to have to be prepared to do it without reliance upon all of your fancy high-tech gear. And I mean from communications to weapon systems. How would you do it? If you haven't thought through these things and you're in a position of leadership, then I would suggest that you get a hold of some of us or someone or a group of people that can help you get up to speed really fast. Because your insufficiencies are not going to suffice if you are unprepared, and it's going to be your ass for not being prepared. And if something were to kick off, you won't be able to just cover it up. You're going to have to live with it, and you're going to have to accept responsibility for it, and you won't be able to hide behind fig leaves. You're going to have to sacrifice your pride if you're going to remain in a position of leadership. And if you're not willing to do that, it's probably best that you resign your position and you ask to be reassigned, or you go and live life outside of the military or civilian leadership. Because the consequences will scale exponentially for not being prepared. At that point, it's not about your damn careers or your reputations. It's about being prepared, capable, and ready to do the best job in incredibly difficult circumstances. You have to be a servant leader. That is your duty. That is your responsibility, and that is your role. That is the expectation, and that is what you will be held accountable to. Do you understand? Now, am I telling you all this to scare you? No. I'm telling you all this to prepare you, not because something is imminent, but it's better to be prepared for things and be able to adapt to those changing, complex environments than to pretend like there's no possibility of them happening. Which is what I hear so often from folks. Well, you know, this group they've never won a naval battle, and this group's never done this, and that group. Well, you can't count on that. You're not dealing with idiots. You're dealing with people that have thought through these things for decades. And they've studied you and everything about you, and in many ways already have advantages over you. Some of which you know, and many which you won't know until you're actually in a situation, God forbid, where they emerge in the middle of the chaos of actual conflict. See, the problem with below the threshold warfare is eventually it creates the conditions where it is above the threshold. And it's clever until it backfires. Now, it can either lead to great victory or it can lead to great defeat. Either way is costly in all kinds of ways, with great impacts that are long-lasting. That's what you have to be prepared for. If you cannot handle that, and you get into a decision-making paralysis, or you want to control everything and not push down and flatten out the command and control structures and have those people prepared and ready to do what they need to do to make you more nimble, more flexible, more adaptive, then you will pay a very steep cost. Do you understand what I'm telling you? You're probably wondering why I'm telling you this and who the hell am I to say it? Well, fair enough. But what I would tell you is, who's telling you is irrelevant. What they're telling you is. So focus on what I'm telling you, not who's telling you. Again, this isn't about you, and it's not about me. It's about us. Who I am means very little in the bigger picture. Who you are, right, matters a lot more. Particularly if you're not prepared. So I want you to consider those things in light of all the things that are occurring, because you're seeing things pick up speed. You're seeing a lot of things occur. I warned a number of years ago about the global natural effects cascade chain and the man-made effects cascade chain. You're seeing all of those things occur. Now, you need to be prepared for all those things, and you also need to understand that there is a orchestration of things that may be happening beyond what you commonly would think of as a group of people sitting back in a cabal somewhere. It doesn't mean that that's not happening either. It's not an either or. That's not the point. The point is that you still have to be prepared either way. You have to look at the totality of what's going on in nation states and between nation states and in the people, right, around the 7 spheres. What is going on? That is a great way of having an ID point, a set of ID points and trends that you can follow to get an idea of where those nation states are, where their leaders are at, and what kind of possibilities and probabilities need to be put on the board. That's going to be key to understanding, because in a war, right, of any sort, there's only 3 kinds of people, regardless of whether they're in the government or they're civilians. There's only 3 kinds of people: soldiers, prisoners, and casualties. So consider it in light of that, and then understand why I keep saying, as it is for people, so too it is for nations. Nations are made up of people. Governments are made up of people. Organizations are made up of people, right? People have personalities, they have inclinations, they have vulnerabilities, they have strengths, and they have weaknesses, right? So too do organizations, governments, right? Militaries, nation states. You know, anywhere there are human beings, these things apply. So you need to familiarize yourself with that. You need to learn these things now. And you need to major on the major, not on the minors. If you major on the minors, you'll get a major defeat, regardless of what happens or doesn't happen in between major powers. But I did warn you that this is not like the Cold War. It has a lot of elements of it, but it's not the same thing. So there are lessons you can learn from the Cold War, but you cannot apply it verbatim in absolute terms to what you're seeing, because it's a different beast altogether. It's much more cunning, clever, complex. Here's something I want you to consider. I want you to game out what it would look like, right, if you did not have, well, let me put it this way, if you had contested space, airspace, and sea in areas of our own country. You need to understand these things. What would it take to do that under the hood? How would you mitigate it? How do you deal with it? How would your near peers, your enemies, pull that off? Who they have as proxies? What would they need? What would it take? What does it take to create chaos so that you have a more complex environment here, so that the decision makers and the civilian side are not only stuck having to deal with the mayhem here, right, but also manage military operations and responses and potentially humanitarian catastrophes in the middle of all of it, both here and away. What does that look like? You know, what happens if you're in the middle of operations and you have a major natural calamity? How are you going to deal with that? What are your contingencies? Because your complexity and your operational environment just scaled up exponentially at that point. Well, how are you going to deal with it? Starting to see where I'm going with this? You've got to develop confidence in looking at things differently and your ability to adapt in complex environments and environments with high pressure, high stress, with a lot on the table at stake. And that is whether you're in an armed conflict, an outright kinetic war, or not, conventional or not. You're going to have to go into some dark places to look at these things. It's not going to be easy. But it's going to be necessary. It's better to do that now than to do it later, or try to do it later, or not have done it at all, and face what you might have to face unprepared. So consider these things, and then maybe if I get some time, I'll walk you through some of the perceptions of things, how they appear, and what some of the potentials may be, and how some things could possibly play out. Until then, test your signals. Don't live in fear. Be prepared. Stay the course. And look out for the highest good of others, regardless of where you are. Okay? And always remember, as it is for people, so too it is for nations. And I'm drilling that into your head because I want it to be in your conscious thinking, because you can learn faster about a myriad of things if you understand people and understand how nations act like people. Until then, consider these things, chew on them, and see what you come up with, right? Test yourself. Good night.